the issues. So that's why we need science on board our activities. And one more point I didn't mention that mentioned by Randall is assurance for the lenders that we don't impact the environment, and their investment is not like used for like destroying habitats or like extinction of the rare species. And one more thing for the company is to justify the commitments to the sustainable development principles. It's not like the empty words, and it gives us a compliance with first of all with the Equator principles and compliance with the best practices for the ensuring that we don't harm the environment.
Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to add a few of my own reflections at this point. The first one is that obviously we've had sort of an audit function of the panel in the sense that we actually, you know, on a regular basis see what happens, and we try then to sort of more or less assess what we think are the key risk factors. But beyond that, there is of course the advice role, and you know, the closer you are to the company, the more your advice is more as, you know, a collegial advice, I guess. And there's been a real tension there, I think, between what is an audit function with advice coming out of an audit and the engagement with the company with practical advice that sort of are on operational level, something that changes their, you know, day-to-day behavior or way of perceiving the issues. And the closer you have a long-term relationship, the more, I guess, you become friendly in one sense, and the less of, there is a certain risk of losing the independence of the panel, I guess. I think Randy pointed out the fact that there has been personnel changes in the company over the years. So the friendliness, I guess, gets disrupted from personal level, but I think, you know, some of the institutions remain, so I can see it from perhaps that perspective as well. I think it's also important to recognize that, you know, criticisms can be very hard on both sides. There has, of course, been criticism from the company that some of the advice is not actionable enough. It's not understandable to engineers. And let's be clear about that. There's a language difference here, not just between English and Russian and other languages, but there's also, I think, a very clear difference in language and understanding of what an engineer needs to construct something and what a scientist might need in terms of describing certain types of issues. And I think that's perhaps where it's extra important that when we do these type of panels, we also include people with a broad experience of translating science in language which is understandable to engineers. And that would be one of my advices to anyone who tries other panels as well, to do that. I know there's been a lot of effort put in by the panel and by the company to make sure this actually is achieved, but I can also see how that's been a challenge here and there. The other thing I thought at this point I might add a couple of words about is our experiences with some of the other panels that IUCN has been involved in, since they do pertain to this very topic. One that we've been doing, and I see we have Dr. Amir Abdullah here in the front row, has been in Yemen with Yemen LNG, which is the largest industrial project in Yemen's history. It's quite a complex gas project as well, including an LNG facility and one of the most pristine and actually most interesting coral outcrops in the whole of the Yemeni coast. And it's moved a fishing village, which was probably one of the earliest fishing villages in the world. So there's a number of issues associated with that one, which were different in nature to the one we're dealing with in Sakhalin, but the approach was also somewhat different. In this case, we were approached by the company post facto. The plant was already full swing in production. And we made a decision that the panel would be more on the advice side and less on the audit side. Part of it was that it was a little bit too late to do the audit part, and you know, what we really wanted to make sure was that at least we could provide certain types of advice before, you know, the last things were up and running. I don't know if you want to say a couple of words about it, the outcomes of that, Amir, since you've been closely associated with it. But anyway, I think there's been a number of challenges there. One, of course, being Yemen, and the fact that actually people are quite afraid of going there, and there are lots of issues, and they keep on blowing up the pipeline. But beyond that, there's also, I think, institutionally been challenges of how one structured is. And there is a common thread here. One of them is the constant change of personnel in the company. So whenever we have built up a degree of trust between the panel and the company, that gets ruptured. And I guess it is tiresome in a sense that it, you know, you then don't, you have to start from scratch again frequently.
But could you explain why that one got started? I mean, the company came to IUCN, why?
I think there were a couple of reasons for it. The first one, I think, was that there was a growing campaign outside, and there was a perception that this was going to lead to a certain degree of criticism. IUCN had also engaged with the main operator, which is Total, to develop a biodiversity action plan. And this was used as a test case for implementing the biodiversity action plan in a specific site. So there was an agreement from the company that, you know, they wanted to test their own policy, and to do that they wanted to, you know, be a bit more rigorous than perhaps they would do normally. There was a provision there to do something they called the biodiversity observatory. I think this is a French term for describing a thorough assessment of biodiversity issues over a longer period of time. So that was one of the challenges, I think, that the company set itself, and it was purely voluntary. The other issue which I think prompted them was, without offending anyone, there is perhaps a certain amount of rent-seeking going on in a country like Yemen, and there was this perception that it would be good to have as much clarity of the types of actions that the company had taken itself for whatever negotiations might happen. As we all know, that there is a transition going on of power in the country, and there was a perception that the better you had your own house in order in terms of being able to describe what have you done and not done, and had your actions, the independent advice you'd gotten, that was actually quite a valuable thing for the company, because it helped them to motivate to whoever the new power may be, that they were trying to do the right thing. You know, this is perhaps in terms of industrial activity going on in the country from an outside investor, half or something like that. So I mean, this is a pretty major thing, and if you look at things as you can tax in Yemen, this comes out on top of the list. So it's very likely that whoever comes in will actually target this as one of their main sources of revenue to the government. So anyway, that's beside the point perhaps, but that gives you a little bit of perspective on that. Amir, do you want to take the floor?
I think one other reason probably that Carl's alluded to is that that area is actually one of the most special areas in the Indian Ocean in terms of coral. It's more than 80% coral cover in some of these areas in South Yemen. And so the sheer biodiversity, I think, overwhelmed, I guess, some of the people in the company that realized that they had a commitment and a responsibility to the world to make sure that this is okay. And I think there were some individuals that were quite conservation or minded or biodiversity minded, and they thought that that was a very useful thing to do. So that, I think having also the conservation interest or the biodiversity interest within the company at that time was quite crucial to you know, sparking the idea. But maybe I'll also comment on the operations of the advisory panel. I think the utility of the panel has a lot to do with the willingness and the ability for the company or the consortium to uptake on the recommendations. And that's not necessarily always the same in the different advisory panels. You'll have more, I guess, situations where the company has the interest, whether it's political or institutional, to do as the panel recommends, or the capacity. And what we've had in Yemen was a bit of a problem with the capacity of actually technical capacity of uptake of the recommendations and then the follow-up. And I think that may have affected the utility of the panel in that case. And I think the other thing, which is perhaps a common occurrence, is this idea that government also has to be very interested and engaged to actually further the recommendations. And that might be a common difficulty or challenge that these panels basically run into, is how to engage with government. It's not just perhaps what you alluded to in your presentation, the Russian or the local governments, but it's also in other panels where that engagement is quite difficult and challenging, but also you don't want to give government the excuse to shut down operations or basically get involved unnecessarily, and it's a difficult path to tread.
Yeah, I think that reflects some of the points. I mean, one small thing as an example of this, I mean, there was a monthly visit by the Ministry of Environment to the site, yet there was not a single report of what they had observed. So from our perspective, this was perhaps not so useful. I mean, it does get you into the situation where you have to ask yourself, why are they doing these, and are they making any recommendations that make any sense to the company, or is it just a per diem exercise for the people involved? I mean, what drives it? So I think that's one example. If you bear with me, I thought I'd also mention a more recent one that we
Is
are.
that one finished, Carl?
Sorry?
You guys are talking in the past tense as though Yemen.
Well,
is
I
finished.
think that's a big question mark right now. Basically, the operations of the pipeline are more or less suspended at this point because of the political situation and the fact that they're on a regular basis blowing up the pipeline. So there's very little production going through the system right now. And that, I think, has then led the company to essentially evacuate all foreign nationals. And so it's more of a defending the investment scenario at this point. Now, it's possible the political situation will stabilize and things will change, but it's also possible it won't for a while. So I think that's where we're at. What I hear from the company right now is that it's sort of on a very low level of activity, and I think they're frankly afraid to bring people into the site also, which probably for good reasons, I'm afraid. So that's the main situation there. An even trickier case, just to show you that we're not shying away from controversy, is the Niger Delta, where, as you might know, there has been a very long history of oil and gas exploration. As we all know, there's also a tremendous amount of damage from oil spills taking place. This is, I think, the first international operation of Shell, and it is a very high profile and important oil field. This has prompted, I think, a lot of NGO criticism and government criticism of how the operations are made by the companies operating. It should be noted that the Shell operation actually is majority government owned in this case also. In this case, IUCN has now engaged in a new panel to try to look at a number of aspects of what is happening in Nigeria. This is run by the BBP program, but my team has also helped develop both the capacity and led some of our own team members to this exercise. I think this is a type of panel which perhaps goes into even more of the political difficulties and the challenges that you might have in this situation. There was a UNEP exercise of an independent panel there over the last few years. I think it's fair to say that that panel was marred or really had very serious problems in terms of quality of product, and was not particularly practical or useful when it came to changing behavior of the company. As you might know, a large part of the spill is associated with people stealing from the pipeline, and the whole sort of process there is something that obviously the company would love to see stop. So it's a typical political. I mean, there was the whole Biafra war, and there's a whole history there. So anyway, it's just to say that as a panel, it's been meeting many more challenges than what I would say your panel has. We've lost the chairman this summer in a plane crash, and we just lost the second member of the panel, and this is a small panel actually, so there's 5 individuals. So at this rate, we will also, I don't want to think about it, but anyway. So it's been very challenging, and it's one that we continue to monitor to see if we can make it work, but it will require, I think, a lot of stamina and commitment from the team that is involved in it. So that's just another example of how one tries to do these things. I'm ranting on here. Does anyone have questions or thoughts that you want to raise? Or I mean, there's another one that we did with Woodside, which was in Mauritania, which was more fundamental in the sense that it tried to look at the future of establishing an oil and gas industry. And it was really initiated by the government, who felt that we might, for a shorter period of time, maybe 20 years or so, be exploiting hydrocarbons, but fisheries is a very important industry in the country, and that's what we want to make sure we safeguard for the future. So that one was very much more specific to what are the risk factors associated with what comes after the industrial development. And I think that's also an interesting angle of looking at how could one design a panel. We are also...
Carl, was that one a one-shot thing?
That was a one-shot thing. It wasn't managed by my team either, so I'm not as familiar with the details of the outcomes of it either and whether or not they were actioned. But I think the development went ahead, so from that perspective, I think there were a number of recommendations that were taken into account. The other one that we're discussing right now, and there's a poster downstairs if you happen to be interested, covering the decommissioning of oil and gas platforms in the North Sea. As you might know, there's 750 or so installations. This obviously has been a very important economic driver in northwestern Europe, and it continues to actually be an area where they're finding new fields. There's been a couple of very large discoveries recently in the summer. However, a number of these facilities will be decommissioned over the coming years. We've all heard about the Brent Spar and the occupation by Greenpeace. That prompted very strict environmental regulations in terms of decommissioning of these installations, and I'm sure that was driven by very sound thinking. At this point, we're looking at decommissioning costs of the order of maybe 100 billion euros. It's a pretty significant amount of investment. It should be noted that the vast majority of this is actually going to come from public money, because it's tax deductible for the company, which means that if you think of a conservation effort in the North Sea, would you want to put $100 billion of your investment into the cutting up of a pipeline, or do you want to look at other options for spending some part of this money and relocating some of the resources here in the public coffer? I mean, €500 million would do a lot of conservation in the North Sea, let's put it that way. So one needs to put it sort of in the size of the effort. Because there's a human aspect to this also. We're looking at least one dead person per platform. Well, that's 750 widows off the bat also, which is a sizable social issue for families and so on. So we decided that we would engage with the industry and the governments and a number of our NGO members in an exercise to have a more open dialogue about what are what's the future for a living North Sea, what should be good options. It's not to give a cop-out for the industry to not take care or clean up their act. It's much more a question of trying to focus the work that will happen and to the real environmental challenges and the real environmental risks. In some cases, we have coral reefs that have been developing over a number of these facilities. So a lot of them actually are covered with Ophelia Cusa. A lot of them have very healthy fish populations. Since these are the only areas that haven't been bottom trawled to complete destruction in the North Sea, they're actually very important as biodiversity refuges that have been there for the last 30, 40 years or so. So it's actually surprisingly so that you'll find a lot of the best biodiversity in some of these areas. And that then raises the whole question, should we actually leave some of them in place, because those are hotspots for biodiversity at this point. They obviously weren't put there without intent, but de facto they are. The other big question is, will we in the future want to use these installations for something else, be it renewable energy, open water aquaculture, possibly disposing of CO2 or other things that we want to dispose of in the seabed. So there's a whole slew of different things that open up, and that then has a whole can of worms in terms of different types of legal aspects, in terms of the regulators and the rules and so on. So just to show you that we're not shying away from difficult tasks, we are starting a dialogue about this, and in fact there's a meeting in 2 weeks' time with a number of NGOs are invited to as well, where we will sort of see if we are going to go down this path. we are very cognizant of the fact that our membership is significantly divided on this task, and that it's not something that we will necessarily do, but we want to have an open dialogue about it at this point. And so if you have thoughts about that as well, I'm very happy to talk through.
Who's paying for it?
It would be a consortium of industry and government. I think that's the intent. A bit like we did with the grey whale panel, where actually the banks put in money, the governments put in money, but the vast amount of the money, of course, came from recycling energy. In this case, we would have a consortium of industry. I think we have 10 industry groups that have signed up, but we've also had a dialogue with several of the states that are regulating this, that they would also contribute to something like this. It's very important, I think, that the regulator sees the benefit and is vested in this process. It's also possible that other groups that are either involved in NGOs and other groups are allowed to join the consortium, so they have a stake in it as well.
Sounds pretty complicated.
It's not going to be easy. And the other thing, one part of that that's important to consider is this will go on for 40 or more years. So, there's a number of decommissioning going on. Shell, for example, is decommissioning other parts of the Brent area, and they will just continue, and they will not be part of this assessment. So, success is not stopping decommissioning, or success could not be defined as